Hey, it's Greg Brown, the storyteller poet laureate of aviation. Grab your logbook, 'cause it's time for another flying carpet cockpit adventure. I'm an aviation author, photographer, former National Flight Instructor of the Year, and Barnes & Noble Arizona Author of the Month. The Flying Carpet is a single-engine light airplane in which my wife Jean and I travel the North American continent, searching behind clouds for the real America. Learn more at my website, gregbrownflyingcarpet.com, where you can also see photos from most episodes. Hop into the flying carpet, buckle up your seatbelts, and prepare for takeoff on today's adventure. Best first flying lesson ever. Clear prop. Any pilot will tell you that flying an airplane is a challenging endeavor. How difficult it was to initially gain and maintain control of an aircraft, the many hours it took to perfect technique, to learn all the procedures, to learn all the surrounding regulations and methods. And you'll hear plenty of stories among student pilots as to how long it takes to master such skills as landing. It's a very difficult endeavor, and historically, about 80% of people who start flying lessons don't finish. It's that hard. So when you fly with someone who demonstrates a natural knack for it, that's a special occasion. Now, I've been a flight instructor since 1979. I've given thousands of hours of dual instruction in airplanes. And I've given probably thousands more hours of informal instruction, which was not toward a rating or logged. So I've experienced quite a few people on their first time at the controls of an airplane. And as you might imagine, their skills vary widely, their aptitude varies widely, their comfort varies widely. Well, recently I attended an event at our local art center, a place where I have in the past exhibited my aerial photography. So the art center director knew I was a pilot and said to me, "Hey, I have a request for you." She said, "I have a son in high school. His name is Sawyer, and he's passionate about flying and airplanes. Is there any way you might be able to take him up sometime and give him a lesson?" And I said, "Tell me more." "Well, Sawyer has a flight simulator and he likes to fly it, and he's been interested in planes since he was a little kid." And then she told me something really interesting. She told me how he had, as a kid, been so interested in airplanes, he would take his camera out to the Flagstaff airport and take photographs of the airplanes out there. And then he discovered a website that features amateur photographs of aircraft from different airports all over the country. So Sawyer contacted the people with the website, got the details, and he created the page for Flagstaff's Pulliam Airport and began riding his bicycle from home out to the airport on a regular basis, taking photographs of the planes there and posting them. Now I thought, wow, that's quite a commitment. If he's that passionate about airplanes and flying, sure, I would love to take him up. Based on that great introduction, I immediately felt an interest in helping Sawyer achieve his goals, learning more about flying and becoming a pilot. So I mentioned to his mother the terrific high school flying scholarship program offered by AOPA, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. And his mom said, "Wow, I'll bet he would love to apply for that." And I explained that Sawyer would need to pass the private pilot written test and have a flight physical in order to qualify to apply. With that in mind, she said, "Well, how would he prepare to pass the test?" So afterward, I arranged for Sawyer to receive an online multimedia ground school program for private pilots. a self-taught series to prepare aspiring pilots to pass the required written knowledge test to become a private pilot. And then I offered to take Sawyer up for a lesson as soon as we got the opportunity. Now, life got in the way, and months passed before we actually made it happen. And just the other day, Sawyer and I finally got to go flying. His dad brought him out to the airport, and we had a good time shaking hands, getting to know each other a little bit. Sawyer is just entering his junior year of high school. He's 16, and he was about as enthusiastic as anyone you could ever meet about getting to go flying. So I said to him and his dad, well, let's start with a pre-flight. So we started walking around the plane, and I found myself giving sort of the typical spiel for someone who knows nothing, right? These are the ailerons. They make the plane turn, and so on. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. This young man has supposedly been progressing on the ground school course at home. Why am I telling him everything? I'm going to start asking questions. So then I started quizzing Sawyer about the different parts of the airplane and how they work. And he had all the answers. He was right on top of it. And that kind of changed the character of our whole lesson, because teaching in this case was more about mentoring than demonstrating. So after we completed the pre-flight, his dad got some great pictures of Sawyer there with the airplane, and we climbed in and went through the pre-start checklist and started the engine. I radioed Flagstaff Ground for a taxi clearance, and I started Sawyer right off taxiing the plane to the runway. For those who are not familiar, one steers an airplane on the ground with the rudder pedals, not with the yoke or steering wheel, you might call it in the vernacular. Cessnas have spring connections between the rudder pedals and the nose wheel, so it takes a little getting used to steer the plane with your feet. Sawyer did demonstrate one of the classic challenges of this. He started to reach for the yoke, but that turns only the ailerons. It doesn't affect the steering of the plane on the ground. So I had him put his hands in his lap, which is not a natural feeling, but everybody has to go through that. So this was pretty much typical. But he quickly nailed that, taxied us out to the end of the runway, kept the nose wheel right on the center line, and did a beautiful job. Then we went through the pre-takeoff checklist and engine run-up procedure together. A little bit about how the engine worked and how we were going to lean the fuel-air mixture to achieve maximum takeoff power for Flagstaff's 7,000-foot elevation. And then I said, Sawyer, how would you like to make the takeoff call? Would you be comfortable doing that? And he said, sure. I'd be glad to do that. I'd love to. So without an instant's hesitation, he pressed the mic button.
Flagstaff Tower, November 54321, holding short runway 21 for takeoff, south departure.
Now, again, anyone who's ever trained as a pilot is going to tell you that one of the things that takes the longest to master is radio communications. So I was immediately astonished because this fellow sounded like an airline pilot. He was just right on top of the terminology, not a moment's hesitation, and he retained and knew exactly what to say for the situation. Now, customarily, after takeoff, when I've got someone who's not flown an airplane before, I'll climb the airplane up to altitude and trim it out for level flight. And that's a good time then to hand over the controls and let the aspiring pilot begin to get a feel for it. But in this case, because I knew how excited Sawyer was and that he had been flying his flight simulator at home extensively, I gave it to him right after takeoff. And to my astonishment, it was like we're flying on rails. He took over the airplane and we climbed at the assigned speed, 80 knots initially, then we went to 90 knots for engine cooling. I give him these speeds and he's right on it. And he wasn't even using the trim tab. Trim tab was a new thing to him that we worked on once we got up to altitude, but he was so precise that he immediately held the attitude perfectly and he climbed us up and leveled us off. And I showed him how to use the trim tab once to take the pressure off the controls. He mastered that instantly in a single try. And then I had him make some turns, and we did some slow flight and some climbs and descents. And he could do all those things right now. So my whole lesson plan kind of vanished into thin air because usually you spend most of the lesson just helping your student pilot achieve basic control of the plane, but he had it already. So I said, well, let's fly somewhere, because I had on my mind picking up a strawberry rhubarb pie from the Crosswinds restaurant at Payson. So I pointed out where Payson was, and he immediately steered the plane to the proper heading and stayed within really basically private pilot flight test tolerances of plus or minus 100 feet of the assigned altitude. He drifted off by another 100 once or twice, but I mean, for a first lesson, this is crazy. He flies us over to Payson, quite a bit lower than Flagstaff. The outfield elevation's 5,100 feet. At this point, we were up at 9,500. He brought us down very smoothly to 6,100 feet pattern altitude to join downwind. It's kind of an interesting day. Payson is an uncontrolled airport, and it turned out there was a temporary flight restriction nearby for firefighting. Fortunately, the smoke was not blowing toward the airport, but they had a temporary control tower there, which I had identified on notices to air missions ahead of time. So I radioed the Payson Tower, which I'd never done in many years of going there, since there normally is no Payson Tower, and they directed us to join a right downwind for runway 24. Once Sawyer turned us to join the downwind, I took control of the plane to make the landing, because that's not something you try in your first lesson, no matter how good you are. Well, I made a mistake there. We were in pretty tight, and because my student was so comfortable and so masterful in flying the plane, I just went ahead and did a tight approach. So I went from downwind, made a sharp, relatively steep right turn onto base and continued that turn onto final. And right about that time, the poor guy started throwing up. I take the blame for that. If I had discussed it with him ahead of time, like I do with every other first-time passenger, we would have been prepared for that. So he was really embarrassed. Anyway, we touched down. I went in and picked up my pie, and we took off to go home. And again, I gave him the controls the moment we left the ground. He climbed us up to altitude, did a beautiful job, leveled it off, and he was so far ahead of the game that I said, hey, have you ever used a VOR before? Which is the navigational radio that predates GPS. And student pilots still have to learn how to use the VOR. It's a great backup should there be a GPS problem. And there are some tricks to it, as any pilot will tell you. It takes a little while to learn how to use it. So we tuned that in and discussed it a little bit, and then he tracked the VOR. I only had to tell him once how to set it up, and he tracked it perfectly, which is not common. So we're right on altitude, headed for Flagstaff, and I said to him, how do you feel about making the radio call inbound for landing? So we picked up the ATIS, the automated weather recording, before calling the tower. Sawyer pushes his mic button and proceeds to call our position inbound.
Flagstaff Tower, November 54321, 11 miles south, inbound for landing with November.
Then we proceeded in. Sawyer took us down to pattern altitude. He joined the pattern perfectly on downwind. And at that point, I took the controls and I proceeded to complete the landing. Now, this also required joining downwind and making a course reversal. And I can tell you in this case, I briefed him on what I was going to do. I flew a wider pattern, a nice square pattern with no steep turns, because I didn't want to make the poor guy feel bad. Anyway, then we touched down. Sawyer taxied the plane in, and together we pushed it into the hangar. Now, it turned out that Sawyer's dad was watching from the gate, so he watched us land and taxi in, and I asked Sawyer to give him a ring and to go over to the FBO on the field, Weissman Aviation, and pick up a student pilot logbook. Then his dad showed up with the logbook, and I made an endorsement, his first official logged flying lesson. Now, at this point, Despite having gotten sick, Sawyer was really excited about the trip and grateful, and I told him, and it was from the heart, I said, Sawyer, I've done a lot of these, and yours was the best first flying lesson I have ever experienced. How much have you flown before? It turned out that he had gone up in light airplanes twice, once in a de Havilland Beaver on floats in the Northwest, and another time on another seaplane in Maine. Each time, these were sightseeing trips. And on the flight in Maine, the pilot had let Sawyer fly for a minute or two. That was his total experience flying a real airplane prior to flying with me. So, of course, I told his folks the same thing about his marvelous performance and how impressed I was. I had no intention of doing a podcast about this when we went flying, but the more I thought about it, this is pretty incredible. I wonder what kind of preparation Sawyer did. How did a young man, 16 years old, achieve this level of not only control of the airplane, but the communication skills, which takes most pilots anywhere from a few hours up to 20, 30 hours to get comfortable on the radio. And here's this guy, the first time he goes flying, he's got it nailed. So I thought, well, that's pretty amazing. And he had terrific situational awareness. He knew exactly where we were all the time. He was right on top of everything during the flight. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to get Sawyer on the phone and let's talk about this a little bit. So the next afternoon, we got together and I asked Sawyer some questions about his background. I said, well, how did you get interested in flying in the first place? And he explained that when he was younger, he was really into NASA and quote-unquote space things. I think I found out about playing the flight simulator when I was 10 or so, he said. And then I got a yoke for my birthday that you can use with a simulator that's like a real one. And then I just started flying a little bit on that. But I didn't know much and just kind of learned from there. I said, well, how often do you fly that? He said, sometimes a few hours on weekends, but most days probably an hour or an hour and a half. Well, that's quite impressive. This is on a home computer with one of the excellent flight simulator programs available out there. But he mentioned, yeah, sometimes on the weekends I'll fly several hours. And I said, what do you do during those hours? Well, it depends on the length of the trip I'm on. A lot of times I'll fly an airliner on an airline trip, and not just a light airplane. So, of course, I got a kick out of that. And then I asked him about the story his mom had mentioned about taking pictures at the airport. And Sawyer explained that his grandfather had a nice camera, and he loaned and then apparently gave that camera to Sawyer to use to take pictures of airplanes. And as he got more into that, he, I'm quoting here, discovered this website kind of tells people where to go at different airports to take pictures of planes. So I wrote a description of that with locations and my photos and created a Flagstaff Airport page. I'll put a link in the notes to Sawyer's page on spotterguide.net for the Flagstaff Pulliam Airport, so you can check out what he's done over there. It's extremely impressive. I think you'll get a kick out of it. Anyway, he mentioned that to start with, he was 13 or 14 years old when he was going to the airport, and his parents just drove him there. But over time, he started to spend more and more time there and ride his bike over, and he'd identified a certain bench on a path around the airport was a perfect place to shoot photos. My next question for him was, how did you develop your terrific radio communication skills? And Sawyer mentioned a service called VATSIM, the Virtual Air Traffic Simulation Network, which integrates with flight simulators. It's something I had heard of but never used. And what happens there is you're actually talking to real human beings. You're having radio communication, so to speak, as you would flying a real airplane, talking to air traffic controllers. Now, one of the really cool things about instructing is all the stuff you learn from your students. It's a two-way street. And in this case, one of the lessons for me was how much new technology can help someone who's motivated to master this very difficult skill. And I got a big kick out of that. I'm going to have to check out VATSIM. One of the interesting things about simulators is that they're generally much more finicky to fly than real airplanes. So as a result, if you can master flying a simulator on a given aircraft, you're usually going to find the real airplane is easier to fly from a handling standpoint. Sawyer did tell me that one of the reasons he thought he did so well flying with me was that we have a Cessna 182, just a 4-place airplane, but they're fairly heavy and they're very stable. And so he immediately noticed that the plane was very stable compared to the simulator. But the bottom line is, the best pilots are people who prepare. The best way to save time and money on flying lessons is to prepare ahead of time. Do your studying. If you have an opportunity to fly a simulator, do it. But the bottom line is, if you come in prepared, you're going to do a whole lot better than someone who's not prepared for a given lesson. Here's a young man who'd been flying for hours every week, talking to live controllers on a simulated radio to master these skills. How inspiring, and what a great lesson. I mentioned earlier how impressed I was with the smoothness of his flying. I asked, were you just doing all that by feel? Because I didn't remember seeing him use the trim wheel till I showed him. And Sawyer said, I don't have any trim control on my simulator, so that's not something I was used to. Clearly, he has really great self-control to hold climb and descent attitudes even when pulling or pushing to keep things steady. Okay, it's part of the charm of a person that age that they're generally not embarrassed by things that might really embarrass an older person. As soon as we got back, and just after shutdown, I said to Sawyer, hey, I'm not going to tell anybody that you got sick in the plane. If you decide you want to, that's your business. Well, within a day, it became apparent to me that getting sick in the plane was just part of the excitement of the whole experience because everyone, his dad, his mom, his stepdad, they all knew about it. And several of them, including Sawyer, apologized in case he messed up the plane at all. Or, of course, it's not uncommon that student pilots get sick in airplanes and have to get past that. You've got a combination of not necessarily feeling 100% in control at the beginning. Most light airplanes don't have any air conditioning, and that can be warm in the summer. It can be bumpy. You've got sensations of movement that are not common in other vehicles. So it's not uncommon for someone to get sick in the plane, and it doesn't mean they can't get over it. So I told Sawyer about another young man, Zach, who I flew with many years ago when he was 13 years old. Zach had no access to a simulator or anything. We started from zero, as you would normally expect to. We flew over to Las Vegas, and it turned out it was windy, it was hot. We got over to Vegas okay, but on the flight back, Zach got sick. Afterwards, Zach told all his friends, guess what? I barfed 3 times in the plane. And a few days later, there was an announcement on the junior high PA calling Zach to the assistant principal's office. Zach thought he was in some kind of trouble. Turned out that guy was taking flying lessons himself, wanted to hear about the flight, and heard all about how Zach got sick. It was something we could all laugh about at the time. He graduated from high school, went to the Air Force Academy. Zach is now a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force. So I told this story to Sawyer, and I'm telling it to all of you. So what if you get sick in the plane once or twice? Fly the way Sawyer does, you can be sure you can get over that and achieve your dream, whether it's military pilot, airline pilot, or just flying yourself and your family around for fun. And that, my friends, is the story of the best first flying lesson I have given or experienced in 46 years as a flight instructor. Way to go, Sawyer. You got big things ahead of you, whether it's in airplanes or not. You're a winner. Thanks for riding along on today's Flying Carpet adventure. Find photos from most episodes at gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. While there, check out my aviation adventure book, Flying Carpet, The Soul of an Airplane, for which I was named Barnes & Noble Arizona Author of the Month. You'll also find my other aviation books there, and my Views from the Flying Carpet aerial photography available in fine art metal prints. Please support this podcast by sharing your favorite episodes on social media, posting reviews on your favorite podcast directories, and donating via gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. I welcome your feedback via my website, via my Flying Carpet Podcast Facebook group, or the fan mail link in your favorite podcast app. Finally, follow my social media sites by searching Greg Brown Flying Carpet, and consider joining my Student Pilot Pep Talk Facebook group. Thanks, Carter Olson, for the tagline. Music by Hannes Brown. See you next time.